I visited North Korea in June 2016, which is the year Otto Warmbier was detained. Now, if you don't know the story of Otto Warmbier, he was the American student that visited North Korea and was detained for stealing one of those propaganda posters that are all over the country. This happened at Yagako Hotel, which is the hotel where most foreigners stay at. You can see that the hotel is actually not located in the city, but on an island in a river that runs through Pyongyang, so it's isolated from the rest of the city. And one night, when Otto was staying there at 1 a.m. in the morning or something, he snuck onto one of the floors that foreigners aren't allowed to visit. And all he did was see this big propaganda poster, try to take it down, realize it was too big to fit in his bag, and then put it back and left. So he didn't even actually steal it. He only tried to. Now, he didn't think anyone would be watching him, but this is North Korea. So when he got to the airport, about to board his flight out, he got detained and sentenced to 50 years of hard labor, which sounds insane, but in North Korea, this was considered a very serious crime. Then this became a big media spectacle in North Korea, where Otto issued a groveling apology saying how sorry he was and how this was the biggest mistake of his life. And North Korea basically said, okay, you seem apologetic, so we'll reduce your sentence from 50 years of hard labor to 15 years of hard labor. And as you can imagine, that did not bring much relief to him or his family. And then no one really knew what happened to Otto until the following year when he was sent back to the US in a vegetative state. And very sadly, he died shortly after. Now, it's hard to know exactly what happened to him, but some say that he was tortured and brutalized by the North Korean regime, and others say that he actually tried to commit suicide, and the North Korean government actually tried to keep him alive. But when they realized he wasn't going to make it, they sent him back to the US so as not to have an American die on their soil. And then after that incident, the US no longer allowed Americans to visit North Korea. Now, I went to North Korea during the period after Otto was detained, but when no one really knew what happened to him. So Americans were allowed to go, but compared to other nationalities, the visa process was more complicated, more expensive, and there were more restrictions. For example, Americans are only allowed to enter and leave North Korea by air and not by land. So I actually ended up going on my Taiwanese passport. Now, the whole process of going to North Korea was actually quite easy. Of course, you have to go as part of an organized tour, but a company arranges everything for you. You don't even need to pay them until you arrive at the airport on the day of departure. So I met them at the airport in Shenyang, China, just a few hours before the flight, gave them the money, they gave me the visa, and off I went. So the visa that you see here is a separate piece of paper and not anything attached to your passport. And they take it from you once you arrive in North Korea. So this picture is the only memento I have of it. Then we boarded our flight on Air Koryo, North Korea's national airline and what used to be the only one-star rated airline in the world. The plane itself was a really old Soviet aircraft from probably the 1960s. And I remember seeing Cyrillic characters, which I couldn't read, and experiencing some of the worst turbulence I've ever experienced in my life on a flight. But I noticed that the flight attendants did not seem concerned at all, so in the end, I wasn't overly concerned either. The flight itself was only about an hour long, but the highlight was the in flight meal, which included some kind of weird fizzy purple drink and a mystery meat burger. Now, I have no idea what that burger was made out of, but I have to say, it tasted quite good, yet unlike anything I've ever had in my life. After arriving in Pyongyang, the first step was to pass through immigration, and this was where I was starting to get nervous, because up until this point, my entire story to everyone was that I was a Taiwanese living in Taiwan, and I didn't want anyone to know I was American. Now, my Taiwanese passport does say that I have American citizenship, but it says it in Chinese, and I didn't think the immigration officer could read Chinese. But then I noticed he was asking every single person in front of me in fluent Chinese where they were currently living. And then I started to have a mini panic attack because one, that meant he could read Chinese and know I was American. And two, I didn't know what to tell him if he asked me where I was living because I wasn't sure if I should fess up and tell him where I was really living or continue to lie and say Taiwan. But then when it finally got to my turn, amazingly, he never asked me where I lived. He asked every single person in front of me, but not me for some reason. And after that, I was able to breathe a big sigh of relief. And that evening, we checked into our hotel, which is the same one that Otto Warmbier stayed at that fateful day he tried to steal the propaganda poster. After arriving at the hotel, a couple guys in our group asked if I wanted to join them that night in sneaking out of the hotel and off the island to the main part of the city. Of course, after my earlier nerve wracking experience at the airport, I had to decline. But apparently, these guys had already researched online how to do it, and they didn't seem worried. All you need to do was wait for the hotel guards to take a smoke break, and then it's actually quite easy to sneak around at night because there aren't many street lights in North Korea, even in Pyongyang. I remember just looking across the river at night into the main city from our hotel island and noticing how dark it was. So in the end, I didn't try to do anything sneaky, but I did try to walk around the hotel island at night. And once I got a bit too far, the guards would shine their flashlight at me, letting me know that they were watching me. But it's not like they yelled at me or tackled me or anything like that. And actually, at the airport in China before we boarded our flight, the tour agency gave us a briefing and reminded us not to sneak off on our own. Because apparently, in her last tour group, someone did sneak off, but all that happened when they found him was they just sent him back to the hotel, and that was it. So it's not like they'll detain you or make a big international incident just for sneaking away. As long as you follow all the rules and don't do anything egregious, then you'll be fine. The tour guide was simultaneously the best and possibly saddest part of my trip. My tour group consisted of about 78 Chinese nationals and 3 non-Chinese nationals, including myself. We had 2 tour guides, the primary one who spoke Chinese and a secondary one who spoke English. Now, you might think in a society as heavily controlled as North Korea that the tour guides would be completely robot like and non personal. But surprisingly, the English speaking tour guide was friendly and intellectually curious, not at all like the stereotypical image you might have of North Koreans being brainwashed zombies. She would ask me questions about what life was like in other countries and what I thought about things like the Korean War, and she would always sit next to me on the bus, even though there were plenty of empty seats, and even one time took a nap and put her head on my shoulder, which is crazy to me because North Korea is the last place I would expect someone to be that bold. You can tell in this photo how comfortable she was with me. Now you might think all North Koreans are short, but I'm 6'3", and her head goes over my shoulder, so she must be at least 5'6", which I would not consider short. Anyways, the friendliness with her was short lived. So we were on the bus on the way to a restaurant for dinner when suddenly she asked me how my English was so good. Now, up until this point, my story was I'm a Taiwanese living in Taiwan. I have nothing to do with America. But now I was starting to get more comfortable and open up a bit more. So, I still didn't want to tell her that I was American, but I just kind of said, oh, yeah, maybe I used to live in the US. And then as soon as I said that, her demeanor completely changed. She looked away, stopped talking to me, and I'm just thinking, oh crap, I should not have said that. Then after dinner, as we're getting ready to board the bus, the boss of the tour guides comes over and asks me, hey, I heard you lived in the US? And I was like, yeah. And he was like, for how long? And then I just made something up like, 10 years? And he was just like, okay, I see. And that was it. So I don't know how he knew, as he wasn't in the same bus as us. So either the bus was bugged and they were listening to all our conversations, or my tour guide told him. I don't know. But fortunately, that was the last time either of them brought it up. But sadly, after that night, my tour guide became completely businesslike and non personal with me, not friendly at all anymore, which is actually how I expected them to be to begin with. This photo was from the last day of the tour, right before we were about to board our train out of North Korea. And you can see how much further away she's standing from me now. You can also see the propaganda banner in the back that you see all over North Korea, which basically says, Long live Kim Jong un. And you can see how big it is, so I'm not surprised Otto Warmbier had trouble stealing it. Anyways, this was the last time I saw my tour guide, and I don't know if her attitude towards me changed because she started to associate me with America, or if she got reprimanded for being too friendly with the foreigner. I'll never know, but I really hope she didn't get in trouble afterwards. Pyongyang, of course, is the capital and biggest city in North Korea, and is where the richest and most privileged North Koreans live. We got taken to some nice viewpoints of the city, as you can see from these photos, and you can see there's buildings and parks and other things you might expect a typical big city to have. But one thing I noticed that was glaringly missing was any type of shop, restaurant, or any other type of destination for people to go to. All the buildings just had a completely bare and empty facade. Yet strangely, you see people walking around everywhere. And I was wondering where they were all going, if there weren't any shops or restaurants or anything for them to walk to. And it wasn't until the COVID lockdowns that I realized they're probably just walking around outside because they have nothing better to do. because that's pretty much what I was doing and what a lot of others were doing during the COVID lockdowns. Or all the people were planted there just for us foreigners to see, to give the impression of a lively, bustling city, which I guess is possible, but it does seem like a big effort to stage an entire city of people and coordinate all the timings of when and where we would be just to put on a show for us. One interesting thing I noticed is that a lot of people carry flashlights with them, and when it starts to get dark, they walk around with their flashlights on. And I don't mean they just turn the light on their phone on. I mean they carry proper old school battery powered flashlights. I did say a minute ago that there didn't seem to be any shops or restaurants or anything like that, but there was one night where after we returned to our hotel, we asked our tour guides if they could take us to a local pub, and they actually agreed and brought us to this building, which doesn't look like much from the outside. But once you go inside, you see a proper pub with taps and locals inside drinking and having a good time, and really not much different from what you see in a developed country. So it made me wonder how this could all be staged, since it wasn't a planned stop, but one we spontaneously requested. So I'd be pretty impressed if this was all staged at the last minute. One of my most memorable experiences in Pyongyang was riding the metro, one of the deepest metro systems in the world. There were plenty of people using it, getting on and off trains like they're on their way to and from work, just like in any other city. So to me, it did not seem obviously staged for us tourists, but I did have a couple interesting encounters with locals. So as tourists, we were able to take the metro for one stop, and I got on the train and sat here next to these two ladies. Now, I didn't know it at the time, but North Koreans are not allowed to talk to foreigners, so we're not supposed to talk to any locals there so as not to get them in trouble. But I didn't know that at the time, so I asked these two ladies in English what they thought of the metro, and they responded to me in Chinese, which I found quite odd, as how likely is it that two random North Koreans I just happened to sit next to could both speak Chinese? Could that have just been a coincidence? I don't know. But considering that most of my tour group was Chinese, it did make me wonder if the people in that whole train were planted there to spy on us and listen in on our conversations. When we got off at the next station, I was walking around and taking some pictures, and one of the little boys here asked me in English what was my name in a kind of shy, innocent way that felt authentic and not scripted. So he probably didn't know yet he wasn't allowed to talk to foreigners. So hopefully he didn't get in trouble later. One of the first stops on our tour was the big bronze statues of Kim Il sung, founder of North Korea, and his son Kim Jong il, where we were offered to lay down some flowers and bow, but at least not forced to. We were allowed to take pictures, but both statues had to be in a photo. You couldn't just take a picture of one of the statues individually, and you couldn't copy any of their poses, which is why you see me standing completely straight up. One of the museums we went to was the Victorious War Museum, which commemorates the quote unquote defeat of Americans in the Korean War, and where propaganda was on full display. We weren't allowed to take pictures inside the museum, but we could outside, where a lot of the captured US military equipment was on display, and you can see all the photos of Americans show them surrendering with their hands up. No trip to North Korea would be complete without visiting the DMZ, or Demilitarized Zone, which is the border between North and South Korea. Now, I don't quite understand why it's called the Demilitarized Zone, because obviously it is quite heavily militarized, with soldiers protecting the border. Now, you might recognize this from the time President Trump met Kim Jong un back in 2020, but obviously the CNN photo was taken from the South Korean side, whereas my photo was taken from the North Korean side. And also, notice the cameraman down there filming all the visiting foreigners, probably for propaganda or surveillance purposes. Another trip we took near the border with South Korea was to Mount Kumgang, which is in North Korea but also holds cultural significance to South Koreans. And the hotel we stayed at used to be open to South Koreans and would be used to host family reunions between North and South Koreans. Although tours from South Korea were stopped in 2008 when a South Korean woman went out for a walk and got shot and killed after getting too close to the DMZ. The hotel itself was fine, but one slightly creepy thing was, after we left, my friend realized she forgot her phone there, and when we went back to get it, the entire hotel was shut down, with all the lights off, when just minutes before, everything was up and running like any normal hotel. So that does provide a bit more evidence that everything we experienced was staged for us tourists. Another memorable experience was a visit to an elementary school where we stood at the back of the room like creepy adults and watched the kids. And the kids didn't react or seem surprised to see us, so they were probably used to having tour groups visit them all the time. I was also impressed by how good the kids were at drawing the North Korean flag on some bootleg version of MS Paint running on some bootleg version of Windows XP. We also visited a public library where we saw some older kids and young adults taking English and Chinese language classes. And again, we stood and watched from the back of the room like creepy adults, and none of the students had any reaction. I did like the floating CRT monitor look, which gave off a bit of a dystopian 1984 vibe, which is exactly what you'd expect in North
你
Korea.
的教室很亮，很亮，是吗？好。
I also found it interesting to see mobile app development books in the library. And yes, North Koreans did have touchscreen smartphones, but no internet access. North Korea was actually responsible for some really sophisticated cyber attacks, including Sony Pictures getting hacked in 2014 in response to the movie The Interview getting released, which didn't exactly portray North Korea in a positive light. So I'm actually pretty impressed they can develop that level of cyber hacking capability without general internet access. There was a barber shop in the hotel we were staying at, and on our last day in North Korea, I went to go get a haircut and they were closed. So I asked the receptionist when they would open, and she said she can call the barber and ask. I said, okay, I'll check back later then. But later I came back and told her I didn't want a haircut anymore, and that was when her facial expression completely changed. Like she seemed really frightened, telling me that the barber already booked a taxi and was on the way over. Now, I don't know what she was so scared of, but seeing her react that way made me feel like, okay, that's fine. I'll just get the haircut. Don't worry. This is the room I got the haircut in, which felt a bit like I was stepping into a Saw movie. I asked her to just cut my hair in a way that's attractive in North Korea, and I think she just picked one of the 15 state sanctioned hairstyles, which are the only hairstyles North Korean men are allowed to have. Anyways, the haircut was fine and no one got in trouble. I think. After that, it was off to the train station. So while I entered North Korea by air, I left by train. And along the train ride to the border with China, I took a few last photos of what I saw outside as I figured this was my last chance to capture anything unfiltered or unstaged. This is the last major city before reaching the Chinese border. You can see there are no streetlights at all, so the entire city must be pitch dark at night. But then contrast that with this little outpost right across the river from China, which you can see does have street lights, but probably just to give the appearance to the Chinese across the river that there are lively and well developed cities in North Korea. I was as nervous leaving North Korea as I was entering at the airport, because as I mentioned earlier, Americans are only allowed to fly in and out of North Korea and not take the train. So technically, I was not supposed to be on this train. At the border checkpoint, right before crossing into China, we had some guards come onto the train to collect our passports, and then they went away to review them. And while they were doing that, some other guards went through the train to check everyone's bags and cameras to make sure you didn't take any photos you weren't supposed to. The whole process took over an hour, and I was worried again they would see in my Taiwanese passport that I was a US citizen and not supposed to be taking the train. But in the end, they returned my passport, didn't say anything, and off we went to China. My first thought as we entered China was freedom, as I essentially just went from the fourth least free country in the world to the 19th least free country in the world. But actually, my North Korean trip was not completely over, as the Chinese city Dandong has a lot of North Korean related tourism since it's so close to the border. You can enjoy views across the river to North Korea and see the broken bridge between China and North Korea, which was apparently destroyed by American warplanes. You can also take a river cruise that technically takes you into North Korean waters, where you can see villagers fishing and washing their clothes in the water. One thing that surprised me was seeing a villager pick up a rock and throw it towards our boat, which shocked me because it was completely uncharacteristic of the people I met in North Korea, who were all mild mannered and minding their own business and wouldn't dare provoke the foreigner, as that would get them in big trouble. And that actually is what I would say makes North Korea one of the safest travel destinations in the world. Because it's so heavily controlled, you never need to worry about getting robbed or attacked by anyone there. So, in the end, North Korea was one of the most interesting places I've ever been to because of how different it is. And as long as you follow all the rules and don't pull an Otto Warmbier, then you'll be fine. Thanks for watching. See you next time.